So welcome everyone to this live talk, to our guests. I'm super happy to have with us today Alice Rawsthorn. She's a design critic, design writer, former director of Design Museum London, columnist, former columnist of the New York Times and Frieze magazine, so multiple roles, Alice. And my name is Matteo Kries. I'm the director of the Vitra Design Museum. So Alice, I think we have a lot of topics to talk about. We've exchanged some ideas beforehand, but just to start with the usual question these days, where are we finding you? Or are you at home in your home office?
Yes, I am at home in London. So I've worked from home for years and most of my work's been conducted digitally. So certainly judging by friends' experience, I think I found the transition to lockdown much easier than many others have done.
How's the situation in London at the moment? What is your impression personally? Are you going out from time to time or being on the street and getting an impression of how life's happening at the moment?
Yes, well, I mean, obviously we're living lives that would have been unthinkable even a couple of months ago. And I think people have adapted with great stoicism in the main to the new regime. And in London, we're in a slightly sort of hybrid situation in that we can go out for daily exercise every day. So in my case, that's walking or cycling. So yesterday I cycled to the velodrome at the Olympic Park because a fellow cyclist friend had discovered that there's a ramp around it. So I felt like a 6-year-old. You could do several laps of it, which I have to say was really thrilling, with incredible views across the city and Hackney Marshes from all the different angles. That, and it's very un-British weather. I mean, I don't know whether it's the fall in emissions. We've had one of the most beautiful springs we've had in years, so glorious sunshine, clear skies, lots of birdsong. I'm lucky in that I live in a very leafy, actually on a green, Jesus Green, so a leafy part of the city. So that's also very reassuring, I think, at a time like this, which obviously is deeply, deeply traumatic for a great many people. I mean, only today the figures were published here to show that the number of calls to abuse helplines by women since lockdown started had doubled. I mean, that's just one indication of the trauma that this situation is causing for so many people.
Yes. Well, I totally agree. The weather here is the same like in Great Britain. It's since, well, actually in Germany, it's since the lockdown started, more or less. So since 4 weeks now, it's the most beautiful sunshine. So that's a nearly absurd contrast to the situation we're living. Probably it helps still a little bit, no, to keep up the mood at least.
I
But yes, we're experiencing really a lot of serious happenings now regarding the figures of the mortality of new infections. And Alice, you've been working really productively over the last weeks. I'm following your Instagram account, which is even in normal times is very productive. And but in the last weeks, it has really become a super interesting source of gathering examples of how designers and the design community is dealing with the current situation. So maybe let's start with that, because you've been probably doing a lot of research or still gathering examples of what you think are relevant contributions to the current situation. Could you mention a few of those that you've published over the last weeks?
Sure. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it, if enjoy is the correct verb to use
Totally.
in the context. I mean, I began my Instagram in 2015, and the idea was to choose a theme a week, whether it's the climate emergency, the refugee crisis, the current pandemic, the color blue, whatever. And every day to post on a different design interpretation of it. Because what I wanted to do was really demonstrate the sort of breadth and depth of design and the ubiquitous role it plays in our lives. So I felt that that tactically would be an interesting way of doing it. And I'm very glad I did, because I've had a phenomenal response. So when the pandemic erupted, it was natural that design in a pandemic should be a weekly theme. So I chose that as the theme. It was 3 weeks ago, so the first full week of lockdown here in the UK, because I was already seeing there was so much design activity during the pandemic with designers, doctors, engineers, coders, people from many different spheres forming often design-led collaborations to address different aspects of the pandemic, and I felt that would be interesting. So it's had an incredible response, and I'm quite unusual for a design critic because I began my career as a general journalist. So I wrote for the Financial Times for 20 years, so about corporate affairs, politics, economics. I was a foreign correspondent in the Paris bureau for 3 years. And whilst it was my choice to focus on design, and I'm thrilled I made that decision, I think part of me must have hankered after my foreign correspondent days, because that's certainly been unleashed in recent weeks. And I found that I think one of my ways emotionally of dealing personally with the pandemic was to investigate it and to try to turn it into a project that I felt could be of benefit to the design community, not just now by raising awareness of what designers were doing, but also critically in the long term, because clearly the consequences of this pandemic, economically, socially, personally, ecologically, are going to be with us for many years, and design could and should have a crucial role to play in that reconstruction effort, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. So I basically have made a very subjective choice of design projects that I feel have contributed to the pandemic relief effort and mitigation effort, but from very different spheres. So some of them are what I would call DIY or improvisational design. So that would be things like the local networks of volunteers that have sprung up. I mean, I'm a member of my own local network and also a volunteer for the National Health Service. And the local networks sprang up really quickly in the UK, and I think in other countries too, but actually are brilliant examples of improvisational design and using very basic communications technologies to identify volunteers who are willing to help more vulnerable people in their local community, and enabling those people, the people we want to help, to be able to contact the controllers of the networks, the coordinators, sort of quickly and easily, so we can help by collecting prescriptions, going shopping for them, or anything else that they happen to need, and have enough sort of rudimentary training and instruction to do it in a responsible way. I mean, even the little rituals that we have designed them to sort of celebrate the care workers and the frontline workers who are, you know, at the forefront of pandemic relief. I think are brilliant examples of improvisational design too. So in Britain, for example, the ritual is every Thursday evening at 8 p.m. We go to our windows or our front doors and clap for our carers. And on Jesus Green, where I live, immediately people had huge cowbells. Someone found a Viking longhorn. I mean, it's a very funny, comedic, self-parodic, celebratory way of, in a very sincere manner, thanking our carers. And I know there are parallels to that in many other countries. But I've also been looking at designers making practical contributions to the relief effort. So this could be designing medical equipment. There's obviously a huge drive for ventilators worldwide because there are severe shortages of them in many countries. And it's been really impressive to see both huge companies with greater and lesser degrees of success, the big Formula One motor racing groups, for example, but also independent sort of coalitions of designers and engineers getting together to develop ventilators, and doing so on a not-for-profit basis, often using open source techniques so everyone can download the specifications online, and to make sure that they're readily available, that also they can be manufactured locally using standardized prefabricated components and 3D printing techniques. So projects like that I find very inspiring. One of my favorite ventilator projects is the work of a senior doctor in Italy, in Bologna, Dr. Marco Ranieri, and he is the professor of anaesthetics at Bologna University and also the head of anaesthetics and intensive care at one of the biggest hospitals. He realised that a typical hospital ventilator has enough engineering power to power more than one patient at once. And so he teamed up with local designers and a local manufacturer, and within 3 days they had prototyped this sort of double nozzle, which literally potentially doubles the ventilation capacity of the hospital by simultaneously ventilating 2 patients. I mean, a brilliant example of the necessity is the mother of invention in design. There are great coding projects. I mean, there's a fantastic Get Us PPE clearinghouse, sort of online clearinghouse in the US, which matches demand with supply, because we know that not only do hospitals and clinics have large stashes of personal protective equipment for frontline healthcare workers, also in urgently short supply, but dental surgeries have them, veterinary services, any large company with a big cleaning operation has them. And so this online clearinghouse calls on people with stashes of gloves, visors, gowns, whatever, to say what they've got and where they are, and then anyone who needs them can find the supplies that they need. And obviously we've seen fantastic examples of designers designing face shields, masks, gowns, protective gloves. I mean, all of which I think has made a major contribution to this effort and has been a fantastic showcase for what design can do in a global calamity.
You mentioned all the different fields now from which you sourced example. When I went through them, I think there can be identified 3 groups. You know, there's projects that deal with data visualization. Then there's what you call these improvisational designs, do-it-yourself designs. And then there's designs from the environment of medical, the reality of the hospitals, which are also a kind of DIY driven, but really come out of the practice of doctors on the front line. You know? So it's different fields. And I would say it's really a very strong time of this transdisciplinary approach that a lot of people have discussed about over the last years, but now it's really happening. What I find interesting, just to finish that thought, you know, before 1 hour ago, we received both an email from a guy from Antwerp who is running a small design studio in Antwerp, and who is close to the fashion industry in Antwerp, and he mentioned another project that came out of the Antwerp fashion industry, where people around Dries van Noten and this studio Unfold in Antwerp started to share on an open source basis the data for certain protection gear and other tools that you need. And they are now, I think, have been produced about 50,000 pieces in Belgium and others worldwide. So, you know, the thought that this gave me is that sometimes we've been criticizing that the design industry is running very fast, and then it's, you know, it's becoming very trend driven and fashion driven. So it has to change every 4 months. But now this is or every 6 months. Now this is a big advantage because certain industries can react fast and others can't. So that was another thought that this example gave me, that on the one hand, we're speaking about slowing down and being locked in at home. On the other hand, it's very much about speed at the moment, no?
Well, certainly in terms of the response, that's absolutely essential. And many clothing manufacturers and fashion designers have turned over large chunks of their manufacturing capacity to manufacture everything from nurses' uniforms to sort of PPE gowns, gloves and masks and so on. And, you know, it's a wonderful way in which people can contribute to the relief effort over and above equipment to people on the front line. I also hope that it will, given that there will have to be such a huge reconstruction effort at the end of this process, that it will really sort of steer us in the right direction in terms of corporate ethics. I mean, I saw a tweet the other day, which was from a doctor thanking Bell Staff, the sort of outer rainproof jacket and motorcycle jacket manufacturers, saying that the gowns that they produced were really the best she'd ever worn, and thank you so much. And you thought, for anyone who worked for that company, even if they weren't personally involved in making those gowns, if they were packing them, driving them to a nearby hospital, you know, if they were a salesperson who's normally selling the brand to their clients, it would give them such a sense of pride and purpose that they had played an important part in the relief effort, that I hope that that also will sort of set a very different corporate tone for years to come. But I think one of the big sort of booms for the design community in this relief effort, which you've already touched on, is not only that designers instinctively respond very quickly, but also many of the phenomena in design that people like you and I have been talking and writing about and championing for so long, like collaboration, particularly sort of porous cross-disciplinary collaborations, making the most of open source technology, making the most of digital production facilities like 3D printing, particularly in developing economies that don't have traditional manufacturing infrastructure, but where 3D printing and other digital fabrication systems can be set up relatively inexpensively and efficiently, very easily. I mean, these are all issues that we've known are going to be major drivers for design over the long term. So it's fantastic to see that in these high pressure, absolutely urgent conditions, they've really sort of come to the fore and have been applied in such a meaningful way.
So you would say that these discussions about design being about social engagement, social responsibility, working in a transdisciplinary way that has been discussed over the last 10 to 20 years. Do you think design is passing the test at the moment, that it's proving that it has something to contribute?
Yeah, I think it's done more than pass the test. I think it's really excelled. I mean, if you look at the general media coverage of the pandemic, it's very unusual that there won't be one, two, three stories in the New York Times, The Guardian, or whatever, talking about design innovations focused on the pandemic relief effort. And so I think it will present design in a very different light to people because, you know, despite our best efforts, the vast majority of people still think of design as a promotional or styling tool, as something that produces blingy smartphones, snazzy sneakers and overpriced hoodies, or sort of horribly uncomfortable overpriced hotels. And that design, of course, does produce all of those things, but has much, much, much more to offer. Many more complex arguments are required to make that case for design. And, you know, there is nothing better than a pragmatic case study that shows what a powerful agent of change in our lives and in society design can be to really change perceptions of design over the long term.
So you would have to write a second edition of your design as an attitude book, because I think that's exactly what you dealt with in the book. No, it was, I think it came out 2 years ago, and it was basically looking at design as a tool of coping with the very fast changes that we're living today. And now I think we're experiencing the fastest and most radical change that no one would ever have thought of. And you probably also didn't think about when writing that book. So how do you see the current situation in the light of what you wrote there? Are you rethinking that book or thinking it further?
Well, design as an attitude is really about the increasingly eclectic, expansive, powerful and ambitious role that design is playing in our lives. And the underlying thesis is that we have a new generation of digitally empowered designers who, thanks to very basic digital tools, whether it's social media that enables them to engage globally with an audience to flush out collaborators, funding and so on, crowdfunding campaigns that can help them to finance their own work, as say most spectacularly the ocean cleanup has done. I think it's raised over 50 million US dollars by now for its sort of epic endeavor to clear plastic trash from the oceans. It's faced a lot of criticism from ecologists and the scientific community along the way, but because it raised so much money, it was able to persevere and go to prototyping and then live trials of its system. But also designers working on very ambitious and urgent social, ecological and cultural projects on very different scales. So that was the sort of theme of Design as an Attitude, and what I tried to do was link it to the sort of mavericks, subversives and radicals who had been very much on the margins of the design community throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, sort of fascinating though they were, whether that's people like Buckminster Fuller, Victor Papanek, who you had an exhibition of recently at the Vitra Design Museum, Louise Brigham, and so on, but also to look at the incredible work that's being done today. I do think the pandemic is, Design as an Attitude continues to be published in new editions and new reprints. So what I would love to do is add a chapter specifically about the pandemic, because I think this has been such an extraordinary case study to show in practical terms what design can do. But there are, of course, design groups who have been thinking about these issues very seriously and also putting their principles into practice and their research into practice for a very long time. So if you think of the work of people like the Mass Design Group in Boston, Massachusetts, their mission has been social and humanitarian design always, and they were very heavily involved in the sort of post-pandemic relief effort in Rwanda and also in Liberia after Ebola, and also involved in the relief effort after the SARS epidemic. And so they had the opportunity to really sort of redesign and reconstruct the healthcare systems in Rwanda in particular. So they've since built extraordinary hospitals, clinics, and also research institutes all over the country, which are designed not only to deal with the sort of particular nuances of the climate, the type of diseases that are most prevalent in that country, the conditions of living there, but also to withstand and equip the country to fight more effectively against any pandemics and epidemics in the future. And so, they are ready to be put into action as soon as COVID-19 becomes a serious problem in those countries. And it's been very salutary to see, as the crisis has escalated globally, how the countries that really learnt from the SARS epidemic have been very much at the forefront of battling COVID-19. So whether you look at Taiwan, South Korea, China, all these countries learnt from that terrible, tragic experience, and it has helped them to reduce the death toll of COVID-19 and also its longer term economic and social impact. So Mass Design Group, it's one of the projects I've posted about on Instagram, has immediately made its knowledge base on dealing with pandemics readily available. It can be downloaded from its website. It began a COVID-19 design response team immediately. And there are other similar groups like Partners in Health would be another example. So I think it will be very interesting to see how their relief efforts fare in the current pandemic, and then to see the sort of roles that they will play with the body of knowledge they've built up over so many years and their experience of situations like this after the immediate crisis has abated.
What I also liked about your Instagram posts on the current situation is that you quoted some examples from the past and pointed towards the fact that there have been situations of comparable crises, be it health crises or political or societal situations, in which design was equally completely disrupted, or the economic situation was deeply in difficulties, and then innovation in design helped people to get over that situation, maybe build up new industries, set new focuses in design. So you would agree that this is probably something that we will also see as a result of the current situation, no?
Well, I hope so. There are certainly lots of very positive historic precedents, but I mean, I have to say again, these innovations were achieved at horrific human cost in sort of all circumstances, and so we always have to bear that in mind. It's the worst possible reason to achieve what have been extraordinary innovations. So one would be the Crimean War in the 1850s, which Britain was engaged in. And that really sort of laid the design foundations for the modern healthcare system, not only in Britain, but for healthcare systems all over the world, because Florence Nightingale, the highly intelligent daughter of a very wealthy, enlightened British family, volunteered as a nurse and also to train nurses in the British military clinics in the Crimea. So she went out there to her family's horror. She immediately realised that more patients were dying of infections they caught in the squalid wards than from battle wounds, and so mounted a feisty campaign with the British government to secure funding to design and construct modern clinics. She actually built on a design template that was established by a doctor in Manchester, John Roberton, which he had implemented with great success. She emerged as an unwitting pioneer of information design by, when she was making her arguments to British politicians, she obviously had to be very clear and very precise. She was making very complex arguments about a confusing and chaotic situation that they didn't understand, and she was a woman, so it was a million times harder for her than it would have been for a male healthcare reformer to make the same case. And so she used pie charts, which were relatively recently developed mathematical devices, and they are still seen even by mathematicians as models of their kind, because they conveyed her arguments so clearly and so accurately, they were unassailable. She not only got funding for the modern military hospitals she needed in the Crimea, but then after the war was over, mounted a similar campaign to modernise civilian hospitals, and again Roberton's design principles were put into practice. And in yet another sort of precedent for COVID-19 and the current pandemic, Florence Nightingale realised that if they built these new clinics using conventional methods, the war would be over before they were sort of even half completed. So she commissioned one of the greatest figures in Britain's design heritage, the brilliant design engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, to design prefabricated military clinics. It took him 6 days to do so. The wood that was to be used to make them was he sourced in Gloucester in southwest England. They then sailed to the Crimea and were constructed. She called them those marvellous sheds. I mean, they looked like barns, really, but it meant that very rapidly military clinics were constructed that were fit for purpose. And of course, some of the most impressive design projects in the COVID-19 crisis have been the rapidly constructed overflow hospitals. So, we were all in awe when in Wuhan, the Chinese built a hospital in 10 days. I'm patriotically proud to say that with the Nightingale hospitals, Florence Nightingale is of course a national heroine still for us in Britain, that have been built in London, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow and other major cities throughout the UK. The British Army has collaborated with designers and leading medical professionals to design and build sort of converted units from scratch. So the Excel Convention Centre here in London, a major event space in Manchester, an airport car park in Birmingham. And it's been absolutely extraordinary. They have been designed and built with military precision and efficiency, and patients have been admitted to them all over the country since last week. But so it's wonderful to see Brunel's sort of his vision and his success with his prefabricated clinics as a direct precursor of that. But there are so many examples of design coming to the rescue in a crisis, frequently again improvisationally, sometimes the work of professional designers, others by complete ingenue. So another favourite example is that of Jon Snow, not to be confused with the Games of Thrones character. He was a doctor in Britain, again in the 19th century, in Soho, in the centre of London, and there was a horrific cholera outbreak in Soho. And at the time, it was felt that all infections were airborne, and he decided to try and identify what all the people who were dying of cholera or severely ill with cholera had in common. Because initially it seemed very puzzling as to why people in this particular area should all be dying of cholera. They came from very different demographics and so on. And he realised that they were all getting water from one particular pump, the Broad Street pump in Soho, that it had become horribly infected, and it was that was transmitting cholera to them because it's waterborne. And so not only, of course, being British, we had to dedicate a pub to Jon Snow. So on the spot where the pump was, there's the Jon Snow pub, and also the what we call curbstones along the edge of the pavement. One of them is a different colour. Most of they're granite, most of them are grey. One has a reddish hue, and that is another tribute to Jon Snow, because that's the very spot where the pump stood, with a commemorative plaque. So again, a brilliant example, just like Dr. Ranieri in Bologna, of a doctor coming to a very practical conclusion, and through natural instinctive resourcefulness coming up with a fiendishly simple but brilliant design solution.
So you were mentioning some of these examples that came out of previous situations of crisis and of the need to have a quick response to a situation. What I'm currently thinking about is also the effects that the situation at the moment will have on our homes, on the environments we're living in. In the beginning, you already mentioned that domestic violence is becoming a big issue at the moment. I'm thinking about the question of the home, because currently we have an exhibition in our museum, which people can only see online. It's called Home Stories, 100 Years, 20 Visionary Interiors, where we try to follow an evolution of the contemporary interior, trying to understand the different layers of what makes an interior today, and how these different layers reflect changes in the past of the interior, be it the turn towards more open plans, the changing role of the kitchen, and in connection with that, the changing role of women in society. The informalization in the 1960s of domestic space. So I'm really thinking about what will that do to our homes, that we're currently really bound to these places. Everything is happening inside. The good, the learning, the interaction, these kinds of communications being online, being open to the world, but also very dark things like domestic violence if you cannot escape. And I think this is becoming an issue for people with children, if they can't go to school, that people with from a more wealthy background are able to support their children in continuing to learn, while other families are not able to allow this. I'm thinking that this might have the effect that we're starting to re-evaluate the home, or really realize how important it is to have a place to live in which offers sufficient square meters, sufficient space, even though space becomes more and more expensive, especially in urban environments. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, London is an extremely expensive environment to live at. So people live in rather small apartments. And I imagine that this might even make the situation more difficult.
It could. I mean, it is impossible to predict what the outcome and the long-term impact of this is going to be on the home or any other aspect of our lives. all we can say with certainty is that it is going to have a profound impact, and there are going to be very deep-rooted changes. I mean, we know that there won't just be a prolonged and painful economic recession, it will be a prolonged and painful depression. And so that will have all sorts of consequences for our homes and every other aspect of our lives. We also know there's going to be a significant shift in geopolitical power. China has already overtaken the United States as the dominant global economic superpower, and that process will continue to accelerate. It seems fair to say. We can also be certain that many people are going to radically reevaluate their lives as a result of this crisis. And as you rightly say, for some people, you know, this could be a productive and contemplative, calm time in which they spend time in homes that they love, with people that they love, and, you know, even if they don't write a novel or finish a film script, or, you know, come up with a template for an extraordinary new design or architectural project, they will come out feeling that they use the time constructively. But for every person like that, there'll be somebody who is stricken with anguish over losing a loved one, a hideous experience of being severely ill with COVID-19 themselves, or seeing their loved ones going through it, severe financial problems, losing their job, relationships breaking down, whether it's with their kids, their partners, their broader family, whatever. And all of those different things are going to colour how people evolve. I suspect some people may crave greater security and perhaps have a more conventional mindset and set of preferences as a result of this. Other will end up with a sort of devil may care if we're all going to be carried off by a plague tomorrow. Let's make the most of life while we can and become bolder, more reckless, and more feckless. So it's impossible to tell one way or the other. It would be wonderful to think that the recognition that, you know, the sort of lottery of home ownership, which is generally driven by the lottery of demographics, how much money people have when they bought their homes, and so on, and all sorts of seemingly coincidental factors, that there'll be a general recognition that everybody deserves and needs to live in an affordable, comfortable, suitably proportioned home, and that giving people that sort of standard quality of life is the least we can do for our fellow citizens. But of course, that could be compromised by the economic carnage wrought by COVID-19. I mean, it's going to be a sort of scorched earth scenario. Very sadly, so many businesses are going to fail. So many publicly funded organisations are going to have to close. So many areas of our life will be seen as being unfit for purpose, wholly or in part, that they will need to be reconstructed. And in theory, the positive outcome that could come of this, that they're reconstructed in a thoughtful, sensitive, empathic, bold way to make sure that the sort of systems that regulate our lives, the spaces we spend them in, the technologies we use are fit for purpose. And designers will have a critically important part to play in that process. And I personally believe that so far the energy, the enthusiasm, the dynamism, the generosity that designers have manifested during the pandemic will put the community in good stead to play a much more important and ambitious role than they've been empowered to do in the past. But, you know, what can be achieved will be conditioned by so many entirely imponderable factors. All we can do is begin with a vision of how we ought to live and aim towards it. And of course, one of the single most important factors in that will be the climate emergency. You know, as Greta Thunberg said, there's a crisis now and there was a crisis before.
Well, you mentioned that on the one hand, there's the current situation that overlays all other topics that have been discussed in design over the last years, but as you rightly say, there are dramatic challenges that will stay, like the climate situation. And another topic that has been discussed a lot in design was also the topic of diversity. Who is designing? the spaces we live in, the objects we use, the way how we interact, how we use media. And I think the current situation is somehow pushing all this aside, but it's still there. And I'm sure it will reappear. And maybe we'll look at this with new eyes once the urgent situation may have calmed down, and we're able to, take up, let's say, a more normal life and more normal discussions again. And I'm saying that because one topic you were also contributing a text about for our exhibition catalog on home story was the role of women within designing homes. So I think that there we have a very stereotypical cliche of how things are designed. And I'm wondering whether, the current disruption may help us to just, look at these phenomena in a different way and say, of course, if we're able to change things in such a fast way and so spontaneously in the situation of a health crisis, we should be able to change these habits in who is designing, who is authoring the world we're living in, who is shaping that world. We should be able to look at that in a completely different way. And I'm saying this also as a museum person, because I know how slow culture is sometimes changing. We see this in museums' collections, that sometimes in a museum collection, we reflect the male Western paradigm of the design industry, and it takes years, if not decades, to change that. But I really have the hope that the current disruption may also make things more flexible and fluid on these many different levels of the design culture. What do you think about that?
Well, I very much hope so. I mean, I don't quite agree with you that issues of diversity have been pushed aside during the current crisis. I mean, it is a very urgent situation, and at its core is the immediate medical urgency of treating the desperately vulnerable people who need it. But I think actually the role of gender and cultural diversity has been foregrounded a lot in the crisis. I mean, there's been a considerable amount of research and discussion, for example, on why COVID-19 seems to be particularly aggressive when targeting, attacking, and indeed killing men rather than women. This is obviously horrific. But it also is sort of, from a purely clinical perspective, intriguing, given that there's growing evidence that in past pandemics, indeed past crises of every type, it's been women who have suffered the most, have been killed in greater proportionate numbers, and have been left to become more severely ill. There's a wonderful book on gender inequality, Invisible Women, and how the gender gap has affected design, by the British activist Caroline Criado Perez, which goes into this in considerable detail, and how in past, whether it's pandemics, but also natural and man-made disasters, women always tend to be the victims who are left behind, that people worry about the least, are least likely to sound the alarm, or who get either cursory treatment or are treated, in the case, for example, of women who need heart surgery, with inadequate equipment because it has been designed for a stereotypical male rather than in a much more diverse way. So I think there's been a lot of discussion of this going on behind the scenes, and also, absolutely rightly, the alarm has been raised about the plight of women who are being abused in greater numbers during lockdown because of the crisis. But you are absolutely right to argue that diversity needs to become absolutely ubiquitous in design. It essentially needs to become a non-issue, because one of the few things that disappoints me about design, historically and also now, is that for so long it has been not just a boys' club and a man's world, but a white man's world. And so if you flick through design history books, the collections of design museums, that is what you see. And for me, as a writer about design, one of the joys is constantly discovering forgotten women designers, women architects, non-binary designers and architects who've produced incredible work that for all sorts of different reasons have been marginalised, forgotten or unfairly rendered obscure over the years. I mean, the same applies. There are still extraordinary male designers to be rediscovered too, but because of gender bias, women in greater numbers. And exactly the same applies to designers of colour, and indeed designers from regions other than Europe, North America and Japan, and the more privileged parts of Latin America. So it stands to reason that if you believe in design, if you believe it's a powerful tool with which we can redress the urgent social, economic, political and ecological challenges of our time, we must have the best possible designers to grapple with those issues. And we're not going to get them if they only come from one gender, one type of form of cultural identity, and one part of the world. The more diverse and egalitarian the design community and the design profession are, the better the standard of designers we get will be. And so we will get the designers we desperately need and deserve. And I think in urgent times like this, those considerations, those very urgent human political considerations, do tend to overpower the bigotry, the intolerance, the misogyny, the homophobia, the racism that has impeded the design community in the past.
I absolutely agree, Alice. And I think you're right to say that, there's constantly new female designers being discovered. Of course, the same can be said for men. But what I find interesting is that the sources are much less developed to rediscover female designers, because we know that also design history has been written with a white male designer in mind. So it's really difficult for design historians to also work with the sources, and that's why I think design history and research is so important. That we can only change that perception if we go to sources and to also question the way how design history has been written. And that's what I see as a challenge for us design institutions, to not just rely on the books that have been written about design since the 19th century. Those books have always been written in a certain context with a certain background. So I think also the critical historiology is an important factor that we need to take into account. And then it's really surprising, I think, how many female designers we can discover that have had an impact in their times. And but it's hard work, and I think that's something that we as institutions need to be encouraged to. And we need the right curators, the right researchers, and it's a work that is really ongoing, because it has to disseminate into our collections, into our exhibitions, into the curatorial to the curatorial practice. So it's something that has to be learned over years, no?
It is, but I think what is interesting and what has changed in recent years is that many of the leading design curators globally have been women, and many extraordinary women have started writing about design. And I suspect this also has something to do with the sort of, certainly pre-pandemic, the way that cultural work was perceived. It tended to be lowly paid, high intellectually and emotionally hugely challenging and satisfying, but often poorly remunerated. And so, and as is true in all sectors, jobs that women tended to do. But this has unleashed, I mean, some brilliant female curators. I mean, Amelie Klein, for example, curated some wonderful exhibitions for you, including the Papanek show at the Vitra Design Museum. Last week, you were talking to the amazing Paola Antonelli from the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Zoe Ryan is the head of architecture and design at the Art Institute of Chicago. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There are wonderful women writing about design. Caroline Criado Perez, I just mentioned, and Fiona McCarthy, who very sadly died last month, is one of the leading cultural historians of our time, who began as the Guardian's design critic in the 60s and 70s, the first person to have that role. So I think my generation of curators and writers, I mean, I have been a fervent feminist for as long as I can remember, ever since my teens. And, you know, we all have a certain political sensibility and certain political goals. And I think the same is gradually starting to happen in terms of getting more writers and curators of colour to write about design, so we approach it in a fully diverse way. I mean, that's something where there's been huge progress within other areas of the visual arts and is now starting to follow in design. You know, you can look at practitioners like David Adjaye, who for years did amazing research projects in Africa. He was born in Tanzania, of Ghanaian parents. And so really, on a sort of voyage of self-discovery, wanted to find out about Africa's architectural heritage, and so travelled around documenting these extraordinary historic structures, and of course has integrated it into his work and inspired so many other architects and designers to follow suit. So things have been changing for the better, and let's hope that the current pandemic, as a watershed, will accelerate that process.
Thank you, Alice. That's a wonderful closing remark. Is one question. We could start taking in some questions if you still have some time.
Yeah, great.
Yes, but one question before that. Is your screen also freezing at the moment? Because I can't see you moving anymore. So
I can't see you moving either, but I can hear you, and every so often you come back.
Okay, exactly. So we're seeing the same. So probably also our visitors might have the same issue, and I cannot activate the.
If you switch the comments on, then they'll be able to.
Problem. So I think, Alice, then let's leave it like that.
Okay. Actually, could I make one more point?
Yes, please do so. Yes.
Your question about diversity, I think. As well as seeing much more diverse curators and writers on design recently, we have seen so many more diverse designers emerging. So whether that's because of their gender identity, their cultural identity, any other facet of their personal identity. And one sort of truism for design historically has been that it has tended to be easier for people who are seen as other, sort of outsiders, whether that's women, people of colour, people who define their genders in a genderqueer or non-binary way or whatever, to establish themselves in new fields. And this has been a period of such sort of very dynamic experimentation in design that lots of new fields have appeared. So social design, conceptual design, design research, experiments on the intersection of design and science, and so on. And women are frequently, or people of colour are frequently in the forefront of all of those fields. So you could think of somebody like Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg being at the forefront of the intersection of design and science. The same would apply to Neri Oxman. The British social scientist Hilary Cottam is recognised as a global pioneer of social design. Designers like Christian Mendertsma are absolutely at the forefront of conceptual design, which is also a very important part of the work of Helle Jongerius, hugely influential industrial designer. So I think the emergence of all these fields and the sort of reinvention of more traditional fields like industrial design really has sort of opened the possibility for people from other fields who typically have been seen as other to the design community to really emerge. And that has been phenomenal. We've all benefited from it.
Yes, no, that's a very good remark, Alice, because I think it shows that this underrepresentation of women in certain areas of design has probably led to this emergence of certain design tendencies that have really brought the discourse forward in the last 10 to 20 years, and women have played the key role in that. So we also see that there's design, the design evolution finds its way, and I think we'll see what the results of the Corona situation will be in design. I think you mentioned a lot of these examples in your comments before, and I hope that you're going to continue to share examples that you're finding with us on your Instagram site. So
yes,
I'm really looking forward to seeing that. So now that the image is really freezing, I propose we come to an end. And I want to thank you very, very much, Alice, for these insights. I found it super interesting, and I could continue for another hour. But now that it's getting a podcast, let's leave it like that and say goodbye. Also goodbye to our audience. And I wanted to say that next week we'll have another live talk on the Vitra Design Museum's account with German gallerist Johann König, who is a super interesting gallerist who runs a space in Berlin and in Tokyo and in London. So we'll speak about the relation of design and art, about his own activities, the effects of the Corona crisis on also the art and gallery markets. So if you want to tune in, I'd be more than happy. And again, Alice, I thank you very much. I hope to see you soon in, let's say, real life.
Let's hope so. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'll definitely tune in next week. It sounds fantastic. And thanks for your questions.
Thank you, Alice, and have a good day.